Flora Chang of Plinth Wine. It is so great to have you on the Mr. Wine Guy podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to tell you something. Having you on the show is such an incredible thing. I think it was back in 2017. You were one of the brands that was responsible for encouraging me to get into cult wines or to understand what cult wines were, to really embody what it meant to have something special, something artistic. And I didn't know much about you, but it was the way that you presented your wines. And this is a brand that's prior to why we're here. We're here today to talk about Plinth wine, but there's another story to Plinth wine that started before that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that before we get into Plinth. But it was
Yeah.
because of you and Jason and a couple of others, but primarily what you guys were doing that was really inspiring me to learn more or to love and appreciate wine in such a way that I may not have understood originally. And so, looking at this season, knowing that you're on the podcast, this is truly an honor to me because you have done something special and different in a way that kind of touches the core of a person when it comes to their love and appreciation for wine. And you continue to do that with Plant as you did with your previous brand. And so, for me, and I know the listeners, it is an honor for me to have you. And I'm excited to get to share your story and your journey in the wine
Thank you.
industry.
And I have to say, there is no Plinth story without that first brand and that first story. I, of course, appreciate it, but it really is the foundational element that precedes Plinth.
Yeah, absolutely. And jumping into the conversation, you and your husband Jason, you didn't start out as vintners. You didn't start out in Napa. It's actually interesting. You were both in New York. You were both working on your own thing, and
Yep.
then all of a sudden, here you are in Napa Valley. Talk about Jason. Talk about you and Jason, how you met, and what inspired you to go from big city New York to the countryside of Napa Valley.
I'm afraid the story is not as romantic as some of the other vintner origin stories, which, if they weren't born and raised in the Napa Valley and in their blood, their stories tend to be like they've fallen in love with winemaking, with wine, and then find some kind of path to winemaking, right? Our origin story is not quite as romantic because back in 2010, it was actually a real estate investment that brought us out to the Napa Valley. It was a purchase of a vineyard. And for those listeners who don't know, our first wine brand was called Nine Sons, and it was located up on Pritchard Hill in the Napa Valley, so in the Vaca Mountains of St. Helena. And we, at the time of the purchase, quite frankly, knew very little about Napa. We knew very little about wine. We certainly had never heard of Pritchard Hill. None of
Wow.
that was there. It was a part of an acquisition that we were looking at. And so the previous vineyard that was there, it had a two-bedroom Tuscan style home, which, as I understand, nobody had ever really stayed in. And the property was just selling fruit to other producers in the valley. And so we, as a family, had purchased it with the intention of continuing to do exactly what the previous owners had been doing, selling the fruit to other producers in the valley. We had no intention of even moving back to oversee it full time. We figured this is something that was already pretty well managed. And so we could just remotely maybe enhance a couple of things here and there, but that would be it. But once the purchase was made, and this was a family purchase, but Jason and I were the two boots in the ground. Once we realized where we were and got a little wiser as
Yeah.
to what Pritchard Hill was, started educating ourselves about viticulture and wine in general. The rest is basically history. We completely fell in love and went from no intention of doing anything wine related, just really being the operators and owners, to wanting to build something very special, giving our expression of the land. And some of that included hiring some of the best in the valley to
Mhm.
help us realize both that vision in terms of the production and getting us up to speed, but also educating ourselves, enhancing our own knowledge. So it was like a parallel path of getting us to the place where we thought we're going to be really proud of something that we built.
In 2010, were you aware of something about Pritchard Hill? But you said it was a real estate investment. So were you looking at an opportunity in Napa Valley, or was there just something specific about Pritchard Hill? And also Pritchard Hill, I didn't know about Pritchard Hill in 2010. And I don't know if a lot of people that are on the outside of wine really
Mhm.
understood the magnitude of Pritchard Hill. Did you have some sort of an insider on Pritchard Hill at that time?
No. We'd never even heard of it, that's the thing, and I think largely some of the things we did ultimately in terms of business decisions, and I can talk about that in greater depth because we ran the business with I love talking about the romance of wine
Mhm.
and building a brand that really resonates, but also I love talking about the elements of building a business. And so part of the strategy behind what we did was to continue to sell fruit while also building our Nine Sons wine brand, which I think elevated that particular piece of land. And in some ways, I hope really even helped enhance the visibility and the presence of mind of Pritchard Hill and people's sort of wine knowledge. At the time, admittedly, never heard of kids. I'd never heard of Pritchard Hill.
Uh,
We were looking at all kinds of things. This one was just one of many, and I'm very glad this is the one we chose.
So you actually purchased what is known today as the Huyi Vineyard. You're responsible for the name of the Huyi Vineyard, correct?
Yes.
What was the
Yes.
name of Huyi before it was Huyi?
It wasn't really named. And actually, when we first got it, we called it Lodestone just because as a temporary stopgap.
It makes sense if you think about the
Yes.
amount of rock in the soil and everything.
Yes, it is extraordinarily rocky. In fact, when we were building there, we had excavated boulders the size of cars. This is what is pristine and what makes Pritchard Hill specifically an incredible wine growing little segment of the broader Napa Valley. It
Right.
has extraordinarily iron rich soils and just the rockiness. It's a volcanic soil that is extraordinarily full of ginormous rocks. And so it didn't make construction easy, I will tell you that.
No, but there's a specific to that quality. And a lot of times people ask me, what's my favorite wine? Somebody will ask me, because I work in the service industry as a somm in a restaurant in South Florida. And somebody will say, what's your favorite wine? And I'll always say that I don't have a favorite wine. I'm more interested in where that wine comes from, the place of
Yeah.
that wine. And I think Pritchard Hill has this distinct ability in terms of all those components that you were referring to, the volcanic ash, the rock, and things like that.
Yeah, totally. And I love that you said that. I think it's so hard to pinpoint just a single favorite wine.
Mhm.
And yeah, it is the place where it comes from. I dub it sort of the hands and the lands from which the wine comes.
Yeah.
And actually, this is just side note for you and the listeners. Because I'm at this point, I'm completely in love with wine. I know I mentioned that to you before. Like we
Yeah.
started it with being like more pragmatic, but I completely fell in love. Hence, and we'll get into this despite the acquisition of our first brand, like I'm still very much in the winemaking world.
Right.
But I love everything about wine, including its history. I'm a bit of a history buff. And I just recently saw that in ancient Egypt and King Tut's tomb, they uncovered like the old vessels in which they held wine, which was considered still the nectar of the gods even back then. And they had labeled the vessels that were buried with the winemaker's name, the date of when it was harvested, and the vineyards from which the wines came. And I found that so fascinating because that is almost exactly what we do on our
Yeah,
wine labels, right? This is not a recent phenomenon to care about where your wines are coming from.
totally.
This dates back to thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt. So
Wow.
I just found that parallel incredible.
That's cool. I didn't know that
Yeah.
story, and it makes sense. I'm always geeked out when I see they pull a wine from like a tomb, or they pull a wine from the bottom of the ocean or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm always intrigued about that. So that's pretty funny that you mentioned that. I want to talk about 2010. So you mentioned how you purchased the property in 2010, and you purchased the property from the late Alex Spanos. So Alex
Yes.
Spanos was a senior board member on the then San Diego Chargers. Shout out to LA for holding down the Chargers. But what was it like? Do you have any kind of recollection? Did you work directly with Mr. Spanos at that time? What was it like taking over where he was leaving off in 2010?
So I was, as these transactions go, I wasn't directly involved in any of the communicating, if you will.
Mhm.
It was interesting because they were not using it at the time, like I said, for wine production. And what was super fun for me is after the acquisition below the house, we discovered bottles of wines that predated us. They were made like 2008, 2009, and 2010. We were not obviously responsible for any of the viticulture or vinifying the wine or anything like that. But it
Yeah,
was this unexpected discovery. We actually had no idea was there. So it had this like element of a mysterious wine that kind of appears that they had made. And we made a really fun label called Foundling, and it was whimsical and had an element of childlike discovery, if you will.
yeah.
I We probably don't have any of it left. Uh,
So you had no idea what this wine was. How did you know that it was around those times?
so it was Shiner, so it had no labels on it, but it was segmented based on vintage.
Oh, okay.
So I have no idea like who was responsible for making it. There was probably just somebody from the Napa Valley, and it
Yeah,
happens pretty frequently. And they just weren't doing much. Like when we got to the house, there was a lot of the furniture still had tags on it. Like the Riedel glasses that were in the kitchen cabinet still had the Riedel sticker, which
right,
I just don't think there was anybody really there, to be
right.
honest with you. And so I'm not sure that they were very actively, or specifically him. He obviously had his attention on other industries and
Totally.
in SoCal. So I can't really speak much to him, but I can speak to this discovery. So there was some winemaking going on, but not in earnest for bringing wines to the world. Like they were secluded in this
Right.
almost underground cellar.
Nice. Yeah, I like hearing stories about that. Some of these kind of you dig them up, if you will, and you don't know, you didn't know it was there. You learn something, you find something, and it's always interesting. I would never know that had we not been talking. I wouldn't even know about what you told me about King Pharaoh and all the things as far as their wines were concerned. So I think that's cool.
Yeah.
I love it when the podcast you never plan this stuff. You know what I'm saying? And
No,
so
you definitely don't. You don't blame a lot of it. It would be hubris to say that we planned a lot of what has occurred. I think we had some plans
yeah,
and then got lucky along the way to have, like I said, we hadn't heard of Pritchard Hill. So there's incredible elements of luck and chance that are involved in all these things,
yeah,
which is basically winemaking, right? Like you can't control the environment. There are certain things you can certainly try to mitigate for, but
mhm,
at the end of the day, you're at the hands of chance, which is part of what I love about wine and winemaking.
nice. So before Plinth, we had 9 Sons, and 9 Sons
Yes.
is what got me incredibly excited about you and Jason, and I remember between 2017 and until now, there was never a time since 2017 where I wasn't blown away by 9 Sons, and it was because of more than just wine. It was this artistic approach. It was your winery. There's this big fan in the winery, and it reminded me of, like, the Uma Thurman scene in Kill Bill where she's at
Oh,
the end of the movie and she's in that room and she's gonna take everybody on.
yeah.
It was just this kinda, like, exciting scene in the movie, and when I see that fan in the winery and I see the tanks and I see the cave and just the way you posted on social media, with 9 Sons and, of course, now with Plinth, but there was just this there was something deeper, there was something more meaningful, and I was always telling people I'm bragging on 9 Sons and everything you guys were doing, and so going back to 2010, you purchased the land, you
Mhm.
start to come up with this idea to create 9 Sons. Walk us through that and what inspired you to go from wanting to purchase for real estate to wanting to create the brand 9 Sons?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you also a little bit of background on my husband and myself. So Jason's actually half Chinese. His dad's Chinese and his mom is from Dubuque, Iowa, which today, on either coast or even probably in all of the US is not that unusual, but 5+ years ago, it wasn't exactly a coupling you would routinely encounter.
Yes.
So when we were deciding on the direction, so we decided, okay, we do actually want to do this. we want to create our own brand, we wanted it to pay homage to the Chinese heritage
Hmm.
without being overt about it, right? So we weren't going to do something like Chinese calligraphy because I think that would be inauthentic to who we were.
Right.
So our goals in building the brand, and we really did think about this quite a bit, was how do you do so in subtle, meaningful ways
Hmm.
that for us, the ultimate goal was storytelling that opened up the
Absolutely.
opportunity to tell the story about the people behind the wines and the lands behind the wines. And so, what we did for the Nine Sons brand was we settled on a very famous Chinese fable. So, in the Western world, it obviously wasn't quite as famous, but I would analogize it to like Greek mythology. Like it was a mythological tale,
Right.
and those who had visited me specifically at Nine Sons would have heard me say this. This is the very abridged version of this tale. And so that tale said that there used to be a time in the world when there were 10 suns in the sky that would all just take turns rising and falling. Again, caveat, this is Flora's version of the mythological tale.
That's the
Is a
version
big
it is.
tomb of a story.
I like it.
So these 10 suns take turns rising and falling. And one day, all 10 suns collude to rise into the sky simultaneously. And of course, with 10 times the power of these suns, the earth is scorched, is absolutely devastating to agriculture.
Hmm.
And in desperation, the emperor of China summons an archer by the name of Hou Yi, who shoots down 9 of the suns and leaves the one sun that we now today have in the sky that rises and falls with the changing of the hours, of course.
Yeah.
And so what we did is on our label, we had alluded. So again, if you had just seen our label, you would not know that's the story. But if you
Right.
came to the winery, at that time, the whole building and the procession through the tour had subtle elements of that story intertwined throughout.
Hmm.
And so our goal was to tell that mythological tale. And what we did strategically was we called our wine brand Nine Sons, but we named our vineyard, which sold fruit to other producers in the valley, Hoyi Vineyard, as an allusion to that archer who ultimately saves the land and agriculture. And
Right.
it was largely built on storytelling because one of the things we considered was what people do find valuable and what leaves an indelible mark is not just the tastes and the smells of the wines, but it is the story behind them and the stories in which they're enjoyed. So we knew that if somebody had visited us and heard that story and then was actually able to retell it, unfortunately, I don't have a Nine Sons bottle here. If you had been there, I would have alluded to all of the elements on the Nine Sons label
Yeah.
where the story sort of was integrated. Then you have some kind of invisible thread that connects you to the story when you come home and you share that wine with somebody else. You are actually able, you have a prop beyond just what the liquid is inside of storytelling and saying there's this cool story behind this label that goes beyond just this is a 18th century chateau. Here's a pencil drawing of it, which is
Yeah.
great for the historical element. But when you are not a historical like location like that, we really strongly considered what can we do when you're not 17th, 18th century monastery or something that predates that in Burgundy. So
Totally. And thinking about storytelling, you actually brought that up. I was going to mention that, but it's interesting that you mentioned that because you get it like way more than a lot of people do. I think when you think about, not to name anybody specifically, but when you think about some of these big wines in not in just California, but around the world, they are known because they are who they are. But then there's
yeah,
wines that kind of step out and they tell a story, right? And not that those wines aren't telling a story because we know who they are because they've been doing what they've been doing and we get what we expect with them. But with Nine Sons, it was almost like you were telling this story and the way you were telling it, the way that you were speaking that story, I just wanted to get involved. And I think that was what kind of allowed me to fall in love with the brand was the way that you were allowing the storytelling to really create the story or to captivate the audience was really what was drawing me. It was the kind of way that you were presenting it instead of this is our wine. We love this land. you were telling a deeper meaning to the wine. And I think storytelling is huge. 10, 15 years from now, if everybody's not doing storytelling, they're missing the boat.
Oh, totally agree. That's one of our considerations. I think we tried to have a super comprehensive approach when we thought about building what we wanted to build. And the reality is, if number one, there are hundreds of incredible wines coming out of the Napa Valley. So that's just, we'll start there. So if we're starting at a playing field where the expectation, I think, for wine lovers is this is going to be a good wine.
Mhm.
Like it's on Pritchard Hill. Let's say for those who are familiar with fine wines of a particular AVA in the Napa Valley, the expectation is it's going to be a good wine. Like we
Totally.
could separate that as part one. Part two, there's also a lot of subjectivity. Like your great wine might be my good wine, and that's actually great that there is variation in what people consider great wine.
Mhm.
And so we had that as like baseline assumptions that we're going in there with those two things. So to have the story that this is the best wine from the best land and we only pick the best grapes is difficult because you're not really distinguishing yourself from everybody else who's saying it and they actually mean it. It's not like people in Napa are just saying it and they're not delivering on it. They truly do care very deeply for the land and for what they produce, which is why we have such great respect for all the other folks in the Napa Valley.
Right.
But then it presents as like from a business and I would say from the perspective of trying to amplify who you are,
Mhm.
you're presented with the problem because you are just one of many saying that same narrative. And so we very strongly considered what leaves an indelible mark in the mind once you interact with anything, and that's a story. And so that's what was our guiding principle for yes, expectation is finest quality wine we can produce. Second expectation is how do we build that connection where we've created a link or a bond between those people who interact with our brand, whether it's physically or digitally. So that was very much the consideration in building it.
Nice. I love it. I have a question I'm going to ask you later that kind of alludes to a little bit of what you were talking about, but I want to save it for later because it fits
Sure.
better at that time. But I want to talk a little bit about 2022. In 2022, so you go from 2010, Nine Sons is created, Nine Sons becomes this like mecca of wine, and the storytelling is huge, and everybody's talking about it. And then in 2022, you actually sell the brand, the winery, everything to Realm Cellars. Realm Cellars is one of those brands that got me into cult wines too, back when Juan was a part of Realm and then Scott and Benoit. So
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that relationship that you have with Realm. What kind of inspired you to sell to Realm? And what's your relationship today with them, with Scott and Benoit, both professionally and personally?
Sure. I will just add, like before that, there was always interest, like from the time we got, so I would say from the time like we built Nine Sons and opened its stores, we every so often would get solicited with offers that we
Oh,
just
wow.
like, didn't seriously consider. So there was always interest because the reality is real estate like that is just very limited. And for some would be acquirers, they were very interested in what we were doing. But in 2022, and I should give some background on our relationship. So we've actually been selling fruit to Realm Sellers since 2013.
13, yeah.
So, like I'd mentioned, we created these two sister companies, one being a wine brand, one being the vineyard brand. And we were very strategic. The folks who got wines from Hoyi Vineyard were making vineyard designated wines, which means they were putting the Hoyi Vineyard name on the bottle. So, yes, you didn't know which land this came from.
Right.
And so they had a very long standing relationship, essentially a decades long relationship, not just with us as people, but with the land. And they knew it very intimately. And so it was the right timing when they approached us in late 2021. I think actually, as far as acquisitions go of that scope, it
Mhm.
was actually a really fast process, if you will,
Yeah.
because there was not as much due diligence as somebody would normally have to do owing to the fact that they were so intimately involved in the viticulture, knowing what was going up there on Pritchard Hill in
Yeah.
our vineyard. So they had a very very direct relationship with the grapes. They knew exactly what kind of grapes they were going to get and,
They were
the
groomed. They
vineyard
were groomed
itself.
for it.
Yes, exactly. And so when they approached us with the idea and the discussion, we had known them for a really long time and it just made sense. And I should add that while we were very interested in at that time building a brand that truly resonated, for us, there was this element of maintaining a small boutique brand. Like
Mhm.
truly, Jason and I had done everything. So it was ourselves, winemaking team. But even if you came up, you weren't like being hosted by somebody who wasn't Jason or myself or the on-site winemaker. So we never really had plans to blow Nine Sons up into this juggernaut of a brand. And it coincided, like, we didn't have these plans. I think we got Nine Sons to a place that we were really proud of it. And Rel at the same time was in like growth mode. They were doing a lot of acquisitions within those few years.
Yeah.
So truly the stars just aligned. And so it was a great timing, like on all the parts. And with these kinds of transactions, there's two ways to walk away. You either walk away as enemies or you walk away as I almost like not having a relationship. It's just like a shake hands and I never talk to you again.
Yeah.
And none of that happened. We actually have a great relationship. I personally see them quite frequently because with Plinth, I still continue to make wine from the Hoyi vineyard. And our professional relationship is maybe checking in with the Realm team on how things are going in the vineyard. But even I think they've done a lot of things really well. So I um even meet with Scott every so often, obviously very busy, but like when we can, just pick his brain and see how he thinks about growth, because clearly they've done a really good job at it. The relationship is long-standing, and I can confidently say we're still good friends.
That's amazing. Scott's a cool guy. I actually met Scott. I didn't know I was going to meet him. I went up to Realm's estate and I met with Juan, and this was back in 2017. And Scott came out and the picnic table in the front, me and Juan were hanging out and I was sharing some Bard with him. And Scott came out and I got to meet Scott. And I just remember being like, I was already nervous because I went to go meet Juan and he was an
You're
inspiration.
all so nice.
I wanted to meet this guy who had inspired me from the cult wine perspective, if you will. And then
Yeah.
Scott comes out and I'm like, oh my God, I didn't expect to run into him, but super cool guy. So I think it's great that you guys do have that really good relationship. And what you were saying, they were almost fitted for that property because they were getting that fruit for their wine since 2013. So I almost feel like it was this romantic kind of like connection that didn't start in 2021 or 2022. It was more like it
No, it's
started.
definitely super long standing. I think also we like almost intellectually align with the Realm folks. I think the path actually tracked, right? Like they basically got reinvigorated
Mhm.
Realm sellers around the same time that we were building Nine Sons. So I feel like we've had, in some ways, a similar experience and a similar trajectory in terms of you're starting that for them, it wasn't quite ground zero because one had started Realm years before that, but this sort of injection of novelty and rebranding, like it all happened to have coincided with at the same time when we were building Nine Sons. So I feel like there was a lot of parallels in our wine experiences.
Yeah, that's
And
super
we
cool.
all didn't come from wine. Like one came from medicine. And you asked about background. Originally, like prior to business school and prior to wine, I was a pharmacist. So
Right. Yeah.
just so I always joke that I traded in one drug for another, and this one people actually want. I always say that. And there are a lot of parallels between the kind of education you get in pharmacy school, which is very heavily based on chemistry. And so it parlays really well into winemaking and viticulture. But we come from different backgrounds, and again, none of us had been born and raised in the Napa Valley. So
Yeah.
we were outsiders who had an outsized respect for the land and wanted to build something different.
It's funny you mentioned that. I didn't plan on asking this, but when you went to Napa in 2010, you were more or less wanting to get involved in that real estate and you wanted to help sell fruit and do what Mr. Spanos was doing. But I
Yes.
don't feel like you were going there with any other intention in mind other than to just not necessarily be accepted, but at the same time, you weren't going there with this idea that you were trying to be better. You weren't going there with this idea that you were trying to outdo. You were going there like with this intention or this idea that you just wanted maybe more or less to fit in, especially coming in from an outsider's perspective. And with such a passion, you knew you had what it took to jump on and ride with the rest.
Yeah, we were largely building the plane while flying it, admittedly, which can turn out great or horrible. Thankfully for us, it turned out
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I certainly don't think that it would be almost silly to come in and say we will outdo,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
having not been there, right? Like there we stood to learn a lot from the people who were there already.
Right.
So it never underestimated what was possible from just having conversations with people and like what had worked for them. And I may be misquoting who this is attributed to, but I'm pretty sure it's to Robert Mondavi that the Napa Valley is a unique place and just industry because a rising tide raises all ships in the
Hmm.
wine industry in the Napa
Uh,
Valley,
I like that.
which is extraordinarily rare for an industry. So that is not ever outright competing, but really
Hmm.
trying to enhance each other as an industry. So coming from New York City where that's not the philosophy in any industry,
Everybody's competing.
that was a very welcome change. But I should
Yeah.
add, prior to us moving to California in general for building Nine Sons and Hoi, I never lived below the 20th floor of a building. So when I say this was a departure for me
Well,
in every sense of the word, I truly mean that. I had never resided on the ground floor of anything.
I'll be
So,
honest with you, Pritchard Hill is definitely the 20th floor of Napa
like,
Valley.
yeah, it's the 20th floor in its own way. So I got the elevation. I definitely got that.
Yeah, that's
There's a
super
lot more
funny.
green, and I welcomed that. But being at that elevation and one seeing like truly from where we were, our vantage point was the entire Napa Valley, all 30-ish miles of it. And we could see the San Pablo Bay, which is what is responsible for bringing in those marine winds into the Napa Valley. So that wasn't ever my view, right? I was always presented with some other concrete steel or glass structure.
Yeah, that's funny. I want to go ahead. I want to jump into Plinth. I want to talk about
Yeah.
Plinth. Plinth, your first vintage was in 2017. I believe you made around 50 cases. So I
Yes.
almost want to say like this is a small question, but were you just tossing the line in the water with that, just trying to see like how that was going to go? And if you look at the timeline, 2017 to 2022, were you I'm not saying you were ever trying to move away from Nine Sons, but were you trying to maybe parallel to Nine Sons, or what was the philosophy behind creating Flint before the
Yeah.
sale of Nine Sons?
So actually, in 2017, we got access to some amazing fruit from Oakville. And what we really wanted to do was do this idea of Pritchard Hill or hillside fruit meets valley floor and blended together. Now,
Right,
the reason we ultimately decided to move in the direction of creating an entirely new brand was this wasn't really the philosophy of Nine Sons, which was very much an estate model. Like all of the fruit came from Hoi Vineyard at Nine Sons, and we only got a tiny amount of it. And what I was concerned about at that time was there was going to be a little bit of dilution as to the general ethos of Nine Sons. And there
right,
was so little of it anyway. It wasn't like we were creating these massive, massive production lines of this stuff.
right,
So it wasn't the main focal point, but like having gotten access to that fruit was very excited to experiment with it. So this
right,
was like the experimenters had coming out. And so we decided, you know what, we're just going to do like the side hustle, if you will. Like the main child is 100% Nine Sons.
hmm,
But since we got it, let's just do this. And so that was the original reason we had started it. Now, fast forward, we have this acquisition in 2022. But at this point, I'm completely in love with winemaking and viticulture. And I'm like, this is not the end of the book, right? This
No.
is just one chapter ending and another one opening. And conveniently, because I had all of this infrastructure in place in terms of having already a brand, and there's a lot that goes into building a wine brand that's honestly just cumbersome legalese and paperwork, which
Right.
sometimes is a little difficult to do. I was very lucky because I had already done all of this legwork to create the small brand. So it was conveniently timed because I was like, okay, I already have this here. We're going to do a full rebrand on it, but the bones are there for us to just hit the ground running immediately after acquisition and just jump in and start making wine. So the wines that were allocated toward it basically made it into because our conversation started in 2021. So
Right.
we were able to really shift focus and say, Flint's going to be our next big thing. The legs are there. We can just build the rest of the chair.
Yeah, when we talked originally and got to know one another when we were talking about this interview, you said how you almost did it backwards. A lot of people, they start with a small line, they move up, eventually maybe they'll have the big brand, but you came in and you like put it was like you started with Yankee Stadium and then you were just like, here I am, and nobody knew who you were. And it was just interesting though how you mentioned that because it's almost this Benjamin Button story in a way. But with Flint,
Yes.
Flint is still not to take away from Plinth at all, because Plinth is you are still in a way you're the same people with Plinth. But it is interesting how you did start from one dynamic and you did have all the bones in place and everything was there and then you just moved on. So with Plinth, talk a little bit about the name. What's the meaning behind the name? And also
Yeah.
your labels are very interesting. In fact, I'm gonna put the Cabernet up for people to see. The labels on wines always tell a story. Just talk about the name, the meaning behind the name, and also the meaning behind the labels on your wines.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, and quite frankly, you're right. This is a little bit of a story in reverse, which I feel like other people might not be comfortable with, but I've completely embraced.
Mhm.
It's just almost like the season of life that you're in. I feel very fortunate that I still continue to get to do this.
Right.
And this is the way I get to do it. And I have to say, I think what can happen when you have a pretty big acquisition is you're a little bit of a nomad. You don't know what to do. I still have that fire and hustle inside. So I'm almost glad that I have this Benjamin Button story because I
Yeah.
have the hustle in me to rebuild this.
I want to clarify, like that's a total respect for you though. Like you guys did this massive thing and now you're doing something that's more of a smaller passion project, but with that
Yeah.
same intensity.
Yes, it's
It's just a
more
crazy kind of
concentrated.
correlation. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I truly just couldn't get out of wine. And you know what? At the end of the day, finding a place or a vineyard that you want to purchase, like I actually always keep my eye out, but it's not easy to find. So, like, it's, I just couldn't give up what I had already put so much legwork in and absolutely love crafting wines. But
Yeah.
in terms of the wine, so the word plinth itself means a foundation. And it's typically used in Greek columns, for example, stand on a plinth, or Greek statue stands on a plinth. So I was really leaning into this idea of a foundation, like where we had our viticulture winemaking foundation up on Pritchard Hill, right? There's this, as I said before, an invisible thread that connects us. I have that wine like spilling through my veins, if you will. There's
Yeah.
this like really deep connection to Pritchard Hill and our foundation there. But if you take a look, and I have a bottle, so
Nice.
just for there we go. What we did is we created artwork. This is a empty Sauvignon Blanc, but you could see the
Yeah.
same character in a different form. He's on the way.
Yeah.
What we did is we worked with an artist in France. She typically actually does more like luxury goods like shoes and clothing, some of the like preeminent luxury names you have heard of.
Right.
And um my mission in collaboration with her was create an image of a person, in this case a man, who is a merry-making adventurer. Because yes, while there is this really deeply rooted, fundamentally planted foundation where we started, this wine is all about adventure, travel, and sharing the wines anywhere where it ends up. And I'll
Right.
contrast that with what we had at Nine Sons, which is everybody was coming to us, right? It was a small brand, small production, and everybody, if you really interacted with Nine Sons, more likely than not, you were coming to where our like physical foundation was.
Right.
This wine, on the other hand, has two elements. It comes from that same area where our foundation was built, but now I am experimenting with getting fruit from other places, owing to our also relationship with Philippe Melka, who has stayed on as our winemaker. So
Right.
you do get access to some really good stuff.
Oh,
I
yeah.
would say that. And some well known and some kind of like lesser known turfs, but that he's been intimately involved with for a long time.
Mhm.
And so the goal with this wine was do those two ideas can exist at once. It will come from Pritchard Hill for our flagship Pritchard Hill wine from Hoi, but we're also going to be adventurous characters whose goal is to create a wine that is adventuring in nature, storytelling and narration in nature. So this sort of character, if you see in every one of his, he has a backpack full of accoutrements. And what I always say is he picks stuff up and puts stuff down wherever he goes. And,
Right.
and of course, what he's putting down is the narrative of the land and winemaking and the wines ultimately that he's sharing. But what he's picking up is the experiences and the stories of the people that he meets. And then he goes around and shares all those. So that's really like the ethos by which we want this wine to exist and live.
The cuvee has an elephant on the label.
Yes.
What's the element behind the animals? Because I also see what looks like a swallow in the air. What's the element
Yes. So
behind that?
if you notice, he has a unicorn. He has I don't know if you have the SB. So he has a unicorn in the SB. And
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, I see that.
the idea here was he is a merrymaker, not just for humans, but for all of life. Like
Yeah.
his presence is meant to evoke joy. And that's
Right.
ultimately what I hope we achieve with the wines. So it's not just like limited to a certain form. I've even had people ask me, like, why did you go in the direction of a male if this is much more of a female led brand? Because I'm behind it. I'm like, I don't care if it's like male, female, animal. Like the whole idea is evoking joy and delight. Like that is the ultimate goal of both the brand and the wines.
Yeah.
And if somebody tries it or interacts with us, tries the wines, and like just a smile comes over their face, to me, we've achieved the goal of the entire brand.
When you mentioned the meaning behind the name, and it brought to my mind the story you told about the Foundry wine, do you think that had any correlation to influencing you choosing the name Plinth?
Yeah, there was an element of whimsy, which I think you can sense here too. And I'm okay with that being very distinct from a much more serious label that Nine Sons was. I intentionally wanted this to be different. What I wanted this to evoke was whimsy and joy and like an easygoing nature. And I've
Right.
actually been thinking about this a lot recently because what I like the culture around wine where it's merely a scientific obsession is
Right.
like unsatisfactory to me. I've been looking at like the cultures where people live longer and healthier. And I don't know if you've seen like recently there's been advice about not drinking alcohol or not drinking wine. But if you look at those cultures where people are super healthy and live a long time, there's actually an incredible culture around wine. They
Oh, for
actually
sure.
don't not consume alcohol. So this is not, I got to, since I'm from the scientific world originally, this is
So
not
bring
my
it.
advice. This is just my personal
No,
opinion.
by the way, I
But
know what I can feel like I know what you're going to allude to, and I'm 100% on board with what you're saying. By the way.
good. I'm glad because I'm like now I'm obsessed with this idea. And this is like a recent kind of thought that I've had that I've been thinking about a lot is we've lost a little bit of the culture around wine, that it is a social element that is a very much a part of the meal. Like it doesn't exist in a silo. It is
Right.
something that enhances the meal and is actually meant to be enjoyed around people who you enjoy spending time with.
Right.
There's almost like this culture created, and I see it a lot, maybe because I'm in the mom demographic of wine is the thing that moms drink at the end of the day to just on their own, by themselves, a cauldron of wine
That's very
to get
true.
away from their families.
That's so
I'm
true.
like, that's undermining the very culture of wine that I respect, which is the social element, the
Totally.
respect for how it's enjoyed and the memories that you form around the table when
Yeah,
you're enjoying the wine. So all of that collectively is my guiding principle at this point for Plinth wine, because that's what I hope to have people do once they're enjoying, whether it's our wines or not, but truly like this approach to wine in general to shift. I wouldn't even say shift different. It's actually shifting back to what wine was
totally. I
many
love
years
that.
ago.
I love that. I think we're getting a little too attached to trying to make it perfect, and we need to come together in the world of wine, and we need to appreciate what the land is giving us. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I
100.
think
There's no such thing as a perfect wine either.
no way,
There's
not
no
at
way.
all.
You cannot achieve. If you've achieved a perfect wine, you had to have engineered that in a lab
And
because it's possible to do year to year. You will not have. So, sure, your approach can be consistent. You might have. I have a certain stylistic approach. I want it to be very elegant and balanced as opposed to hit you in the face. So there's going to be stylistic consistency across vintages, but for it
right.
to be exactly the same and quote unquote a perfect wine, impossible in my book.
I interviewed Tor back in the day, and I said, what's one of the things you really want to get out of the wine industry? Because you've been doing this for so long, you're like one of the goats." And he said, "I'm tired of all these 100-point wines. I want to make like 101 or 102-point wine." He's like, "I just want to make better wines." And it's funny that you mentioned that because it brought me back to Tor when he said that. We both just started dying laughing. And speaking of icons and monumental people, you did allude to Philippe Melka, and, you have Philippe, and you also have Mayan Kashitsky. I've had
Yeah.
the honor to have both of them individually on my podcast, and what is it like having them as your winemakers? So, basically, when you have them helping create these wines for you, what is it that they do that is so special and so unique in comparison to other people? Which, by the way, there's nothing wrong with other people or other winemakers, but obviously Philippe and mine are just so iconic. What is it like having them in their own unique way?
I will start with I love working with both of them. I will say one thing that I really enjoy, just from a personality perspective, is they don't bring an ego to the wine. What they build, I'm obviously only talking about my personal experience. What they bring is incredible passion and expertise without the
Right.
corresponding ego that I have encountered elsewhere. Because primarily, I will say 90% of the winemaking is Philippe and like some of the others in terms of how I operate. Just I do work with Maya, but primarily on the winemaking side, do a lot of it with Philippe.
Right.
It's just the incredible expertise to know offhand, just by virtue of his recollection of what happened in which vintage and what that was like, the exposure to almost at this point every area of the world and what it has to offer. There is no way for all of that condensed knowledge not to make its presence known in your one bottle of
You
wine.
know who he
Yes.
reminds me of? He reminds me
Who?
of a modern day Andrei Telechev. That's who
Yes. Oh, that's actually a really good comparison. Yeah,
oh,
because there it's pure sharing of knowledge. It
right.
is like purely knowledge that is being exercised, but he's also the humility goes beyond just like, I'm going to, I've never heard Philippe say, I will say this, I've never heard Philippe say, we're going to make 100-point wine. That is a conversation that we've literally never had.
Yeah.
But the greatest respect that I have is that every single time we're walking the vineyards, all he's doing is looking at the soils, the canopies, the grapes, the flavors, all of it collectively. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what the weather patterns are holding in. I think it's just the sheer volume of knowledge that he's acquired while simultaneously having the understanding for creating a wine that's not just reflective of him, but he knows the kind of wines that I want to make. So we
Yeah.
will spend countless hours tasting through things until we achieve that. As opposed to, and I truly mean this, it's not just like a rubber stamp, like Philippe has never shown up and it's just his name. Like those wines are genuinely crafted by his hand, by his palate, with us sitting for hours and tasting through everything. So
That's super cool. It reminds me of if they're asking me a question about what wine do you recommend with their meal, every time my first question to them is what kind of wines do you like? Or if they want a particular wine, I'm like, do you like this style of Chardonnay? Do you like a dry and oaky, something buttery? Because it's
yeah.
not about, I think people are leaning on me to give them a good wine, but if that's a good wine, going back to subjectivity, if that's a
Mhm.
good wine, that may not be a good wine for them. And I've never correlated the idea that a consulting winemaker, or somebody like Philippe, like you just mentioned, is almost giving to you what you want to make out of wines according to the kind of stylistic approach that you have towards the wines that you love.
You hit the nail on the head. It is almost like a somm who is like you, as a somm, you know what you guys have in your cellar. And based on what the person described to you, you're like, I got the bottle for you.
Totally.
Same thing here. He has intimate knowledge of every square inch of the Napa Valley. So, like with the cuvee, so he definitely knows Pritchard Hill. But then I'm like, okay, here's what I'm trying to achieve with the cuvee. Okay. We're going to narrow it down to this particular bench of the Napa Valley. Let's start trying going through it as we like narrow in on that goal.
Yeah.
Uh,
He's never putting himself in the element. He's always just leaving it to you.
Let me put it this way. He's there. Like we just picked our Sauvignon Blanc and we were just actually walking the vineyards checking because harvest is delayed this year.
Mhm.
He's putting himself in the element as the expert, right? Okay, I know what kind of wines we make with plants. Here are some considerations for us pulling the fruit in. For our
Right.
Sauvignon Blanc, we know what kind of wine we're trying to achieve, right? So we want something that's both light on its feet, but has a depth.
Right.
He will change the program just ever so slightly based on how the fruit came in when it's tasted, what its acids and sugars are looking like for our press, because it goes through this like really gentle press cycle for
Yeah.
a painstaking amount of time. And so that's what he's doing. Okay, we're going to be pressing for X number of hours versus this number of hours
Oh, cool.
with a different press cycle, like the rotation of the press,
Right.
how long we're going to be doing it for. So those are the elements. It's the expertise on the bigger picture that translates down to these individual decisions that you make
Mhm.
from the time it goes from the vine into the bottle.
What are your thoughts? Let's say me and you are talking in 5 years, or somebody's asking you in 5 years, what do you think about that 2023 vintage? What are your initial first few words on your idea of what this vintage is gonna bring, considering it's a little bit of a later harvest?
Later is relative because I think it's actually going back to what Napa
True.
used to. I
Thank
think
you.
what we all got accustomed to is everything being earlier and earlier because it was extraordinarily dry and extraordinarily hot. And just sorry to go back to this real quick, just the level of expertise and maybe sometimes difficult decision making. Like 2022 had incredible heat spikes. There were
Mhm.
days where it was like 115, 117. And so then you're stuck in this position, right? Do I pick? Do I
Yeah.
not pick? Right?
Yeah.
Because that's going to affect, because it was early September, like late
Right.
August, early September. So Philippe and I were actually just talking about this, that we were tasting through the 22s and barrels. And he was like, I am so glad I made the decision to pick when I did, because we actually ended up picking right before there was like a weekend heat spike. I think we had the opportunity to create very elegant wines that
Okay.
aren't, I think there's even just like a reversion to the mean, like not overly extracted, overly ripe wines, but rather ones generally across the valley that are slightly less, just have lower alcohol ever so slightly, and it just ever so slightly more elegant. So I'm personally excited about it.
I feel like it's gonna be, a reference to the past in a way, because
Yeah.
of the time of year, it's almost falling in line, falling into place. We'll almost have a reference to the past that we'll be drinking in 10 years, and we'll say, "Wow, that really reminded me of," say, if I was drinking something 10 years earlier in 2015. or something
Yeah.
along those lines. It gave me that same vibe, that same impression because of the way that harvest put itself back in line with
Yeah,
the oil.
exactly. You hit the nail on the head. There's some elements of the 2023 vintage, not in terms of weather patterns, but there was a lower fruit set. So I think yields might be a little bit lower, like they
Mhm.
were in 2015. But what Philippe said is he's seeing a lot of the stuff that he saw when he was here in the 90s. So I feel like I'm coming full circle, which might be a sign. I've made it all around
Yeah.
the circumference of the circle. Like, no, you're not getting any ideas.
I'm thinking
Yeah.
about the 2021. Did you declassify your wines in 2020?
We didn't even make wine. So we dropped all of the fruit. We literally went through, dropped all the fruit. We made no nine sons. We didn't sell a single cluster to any of the buyers. There's different philosophies on this, I will say. 2020, there were some people who decided to make the wines,
Uh,
measure it along. We ultimately decided not to take that risk.
that was gonna be a
I-
question that I had. I wanted to ask you because I was gonna lead up. Did you use 2020 as an opportunity to look at the season in a different way, basically? Whether it was growing or maybe to get the books again? I don't know, like, how to ask the question, but what was it about that time since you didn't make wine? What did you do with your time to help yourself improve on vintages moving forward?
Yeah, that was a very sobering experience because we were obviously like adding insult to injury because COVID, we were closed. And then the fires hit, which was actually to us specifically, and I would imagine to the wine industry in general, the more problematic of it too, because people were actually ordering wine. So in terms of sales or
Oh,
like
yeah.
running a business, it wasn't
Yeah.
as hard hit. At least that's my experience.
Right.
I statistics seem to corroborate that.
Yeah.
But then the fires hit and it was more the lack of insight into what might happen.
Mm.
So we had two considerations in dropping the fruit. Number one, as I'd mentioned before, we were obligating people to put Hoyi Vineyard on the label, right? So we were obligating them via contract to purchase the grapes. Then we then cannot control what they do with it. And if they choose to put a wine that we personally would not have bottled,
True.
we can't dictate that they don't do that. And now we face a brand problem, right? Because
Totally.
they bottled something that has Hoyi Vineyard on it when they would have preferred not to, but now economic realities are now
Your
dictating what they have to do.
your brand is everything. I totally
Exactly. And so
100%.
for us, it was not worth the risk. And we took a huge hit because the reality is when we had David Abreu farming the land, he still farms Hoyi Vineyard and takes care of all the viticulture. Like you had still paid for all of the vineyard management,
Right.
even though you're dropping the fruit. So that was a very difficult decision to make as a business. But ultimately, you're 100% right. Like your brand is everything. And that was for us a risk we weren't willing to engage in.
Right.
Others had. It certainly changed our calculus in some ways because, all of our eggs were in a single basket. And I think that's why we were more amenable to even the conversation with Realm because we were suddenly in this unfortunate reality that you really don't know. We had the devastating fires in 2017. For us, luckily, they had hit later in the season. And so all of our fruit has already been in tank in 17. So we weren't affected.
Right.
Different story in 2020. And I certainly hope that's the history of the Napa Valley and not the future of the Napa Valley. But the climate reality dictates otherwise. And so it certainly had us recalibrating what we were wanting to do long term.
Yeah, going back to, talking about Pritchard Hill, talking about the vineyard. When somebody tries the Cabernet, and the Cabernet is 100% cab from the vineyard, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, the 100% Pritchard Hill, Holy Vineyard, and 100% Cab.
What is a way that you describe this wine to a consumer if they wanna know how is this wine gonna differentiate or taste in such a way that's very specific to the site? Because we alluded about elevation, we talked about the rocks in the soil, and you told the story about the big boulder. What is the one distinct thing about on that terroir that really stands out to you, when you're describing the wine to somebody?
I'm going to violate the request for a single thing because I genuinely cannot boil it down to just one thing.
Right?
If I were to encompass it, and this is a marriage of winemaking decisions and the terroir,
Mhm.
It's the ability to have both elegance and depth and strength in one bottling.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that is everything. It is not egregious in any way. It is supremely balanced in that way. And even at Nine Sons, when we would say, like, our tagline was, "This is a story of balance," because we were storytelling, but in the wines and in everything we did, balance was where we were trying to hit. And so that very much has been a holdover for Plinth. And I think that is what we're able to achieve on that particular site with that particular terroir. And if we're to jump a little bit deeper into it, it's the ability to have qualities of red fruit, like really showcase on the initial taste. But then you do start getting some of the minerality, some fennel, some
Yeah.
lavender that really start shining through. And I think that's the consistent element across a lot of the wines that are made up on that hill.
You have, I wanna say you make around 600 cases now. When you started, you made roughly 50 cases or so, so definitely have moved up in the case department, but you
Mhm.
mentioned something earlier about basically you wanna get different fruit from different places to try to express more. Do you see yourself stepping a little bit higher than the 600? Or are you gonna tighten up what you have, or is the sky the limit?
I wouldn't say the full sky's the limit. It's what I'm limited by is my obsession with wanting it to be a certain way, and there's only a limited amount of fruit that you could do that
Totally.
with. So certainly open. And yes, our goal is, especially with the cuvee adventuring wine, that's experimenting with everything that the Valley and Philippe has to offer.
Right.
And giving him the opportunity to be or showcasing the art of the blend, if you will. That's really the goal of that wine. We'll certainly grow. We'll never be a huge brand. That
Of
is
course, yeah.
absolutely not the goal. But yeah, larger than a couple of hundred cases for sure. Just so we can get it into more people's hands. Like, I think for me, and I'm not sure a lot of vintners will say this, I don't want wines that are exclusively relegated to people's cellars that never come out. I want wines that people are like taking out and enjoying, whether or not it's a very special occasion or it's just a Tuesday night
Yeah.
and they're just trying to enjoy their Tuesday. That to me is equally special. And I'm hoping they're pulling the wines out to enjoy it.
I love that. I think we're entering a time where we're not holding as much, but we're not doing it in a way that we don't appreciate the wines. I think we're just in a time where we want to appreciate wines more. I actually got some
Yes.
wines off of WineBid. They're gonna ship them out in November. One of them is an '01 made by Celia Welch. One's an
Oh,
'09, and one's an Australian Shiraz, an '03. And I'm not gonna hold them. I'm just trying to,
yeah.
in my mind, I'm like, "How did they make it?" Like, they should have been drank already. I think we're in that
When did
time.
they last? You
Yeah.
know what I've been really enjoying the last few prior to pregnancy? 90s Robert Mondavi reserves.
Oh, yeah?
They are spectacular. They're probably hard to find just given that they're 90s wines, but
Yeah.
yeah, if you have a chance to get your hands on some,
I'll do it.
really beautiful wines. And for me, like I said, I'm a bit of a history buff. Like, I love that history in the Napa Valley.
Yeah, that's super cool. So, unfortunately, we're coming up to the end of the conversation. I have a couple of questions that I did want to ask.
Yeah.
The first one is, we talked about how, and I mentioned this in the middle of the interview, but I'll mention it again because of the follow up to it, which is when you came to Napa, you were very much about being a part of what was going on. You wanted to help contribute, and you wanted to learn, and you wanted to grow. And would you agree, though, looking back on everything, I think it's been like 14 years now that you've been in the wine industry.
That's
Wouldn't you
crazy.
agree that your contributions to the wine industry have made such an impact? You have almost been the pedestal where people want to climb, where people want to go. Like, you are that person that everybody wants to emulate. Would you agree that your storytelling and your wines and everything, the people that you are, you and Jason, have really contributed to the reason why people love and appreciate wine so much today?
I hope so. I certainly did not set out with that goal, but if there's an element that inspires and draws people into wine, fine
Yeah.
wines, Napa Valley wines, and encourages discovery,
Yeah.
I am all for it,
Yeah.
whatever it takes. Because I think what I discovered, because like I said, in the beginning, it was much more pragmatic in nature.
Totally.
Uh, and I even started this interview by saying it wasn't so romantic in its origins. But if anything we've done or anything we've made inspires or brings delight and joy, like to me, I would have considered us having succeeded,
Yeah.
honestly.
So tell me, Flora, how can people learn about you? How can they find you on social media, your website? And of course, how can they sign up to get allocations and purchase your wines?
They can go to plinthwine.com.
Uh-huh.
We are at Plinth Wine on Instagram, and I forgot my own handle on Instagram, but I'm sure you could find it through
Oh, yeah.
the
I don't know if I follow you on Instagram, but
Yeah,
my
you know
plans.
what? I'm not as active on the personal one, so
Yeah.
at Plinth Wine on Instagram and plinthwine.com are the 2 ways to do it, and dear baby, we really wanna lean into this adventuring spirit, so we might be coming to a city near you to share the wines and the stories.
Love that. And shout out to you and Jason. Expecting your first child?
2nd, this
Second
is, 2nd child. Our first is almost 5.
Okay.
And for a while, so he was very much a part of what was going on in the winery. And for a short while, he believed that winemakers live in caves, that at the end of the day, they go into their cave to go to sleep, and that every morning they come out of the wine cave to start work.
Maybe a
So,
future winemaker. You never know.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we never bothered correcting that because why would we?
No way.
Yeah.
So my last question for you today is looking forward, say 10 years from now, when you look back on this chapter, on
Mhm.
all the ways that you're making an impact in the wine industry, what is the one or maybe a couple of things? It doesn't have to be one specific, but what is something that you want to be able to talk about that you were able to accomplish or that you were able to see happen that is really going to inspire or impact you looking back on it, say 10 years from now?
I think now that I have this shift in philosophy a little, if people are talking about wine, like I said, the way wine used to be,
Yeah.
as a social vehicle, as something with great respect for what I said, the hands and the lands from which it comes, to me, that 10 years on would feel incredible. Like that it is part of a larger approach to a life well lived.
I feel like I could have spent so much more time. The time is limited, and I know you're busy, and I could ask questions all day. I had to be strategic on what I was going to ask because you're this encyclopedia of wealth and knowledge and experience. And I hope today that I was able to just tap in a little bit to what you and Jason have done in Napa, to the names that you've created in the industry and being who you are. I couldn't say it enough to you. I've always, looked up to you guys, and I
Oh,
just really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me on the show today.
oh, thank you for having me. This was so fun.